She woke up to the sound of someone breathing into her mouth, not beside her, not across the room, right over her. Like something was bent down from the ceiling, lungs full of smoke, struggling to exhale, directly into her. And when she finally opened her eyes just a little, she saw it, a shape darker than the darkness itself, tall as a tree, with branches growing from its head and arms, standing at the foot of her bed and leaning over her face. Jake, do you think this is a monster?
If something that looks like a walking tree is breathing into your mouth in the middle of the night, yeah, we're not talking about a bad dream anymore. We need to break this down.
Before we get into what this creature might be, if you like real accounts of impossible beings that show up when the lights are off and everyone thinks they're safe, subscribe and stay with us. Because tonight's story doesn't start in an old cabin or a haunted forest. It starts in a very normal house with a very tired student. For months, her life ran on a strict routine. Every morning around 4 a.m., she'd wake up, lace her shoes, and run about 5 miles before a long day of classes and studying. By the time night came, her body was completely drained. Falling asleep wasn't a problem. Sometimes she barely remembered lying down. The house where she lived with her parents was split into 3 levels. On the first floor, near the garage, there was a single room. That was her bedroom. Above, on the second floor, with a kitchen, dining room and living room, the normal movement of the house. At the very top, on the third floor, were the guest room and her parents' bedroom. Her parents almost never came down to her room at night. They respected her space. If she was down there, she was either studying or sleeping. That night felt just like any other. She finished revising her notes, closed her books, took a shower, and went to bed with the Golden Girls playing softly on the TV in the corner. It was a familiar comfort. She always set the sleep timer so the TV would turn itself off eventually. A small glow in the room, soft voices, a sense that the world was harmless. She drifted off. No screaming, no nightmare, no strange feeling, just sleep. Until the breathing started. At first, it slid into her awareness like a background noise, a rough, raspy sound, heavy breathing, but not like someone snoring, more like someone trying to pull air past damaged lungs, like their chest was full of smoke or ash or water, and every breath was a struggle. Her eyes stayed closed. That's important. She didn't bolt upright. She didn't turn her head. Instinctively, she knew something was wrong in the room, and another instinct, even older, told her, "Don't let it know you're awake." The breathing grew louder. She became aware of heat on her lips, not just close to her face, on her mouth. Whoever, or whatever, was breathing was doing it directly into her, like it was trying to share its breath or steal hers. Jake. That detail, breathing into the mouth, that's not random. Predators in nature test the livingness of prey. And in a lot of folklore, entities that feed on fear or life force like to get as close as possible to the breath. That's where we're most vulnerable. She knew instantly. This wasn't either of her parents. They never came into her room at night. They didn't breathe like that. They would have spoken, touched her shoulder, woken her gently. This presence did none of that. It just breathed. She lay there, frozen, heart slamming against her ribs, listening to the wet, smoky drag of air. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Very, very slowly, she let her eyelids separate, just a fraction, just enough to see if there was something there. There was. Standing over her, from the left side of the bed, was a figure that her mind struggled to classify as anything human. It was tall, far too tall for the low ceiling of the downstairs room. It didn't glow, it didn't shimmer, it didn't look transparent. It was simply darker than the darkness. Around it, a solid absence of light that broke the shape of the room, and it had branches. They weren't clean, elegant antlers or decorative horns. They were jagged, irregular shapes erupting from its head and shoulders, splitting from its arms, like dead limbs of a tree fused into a torso, trying to remember how to be a body. When she later tried to describe it, the closest comparison her mind found was Groot, from Guardians of the Galaxy, but only in the basic idea of a tree-like humanoid. At the time of the encounter, she hadn't even seen that movie yet, and Groot, she would say years later, looks gentle. This thing did not. This thing felt wrong. The tree-like structure didn't look friendly or cartoonish. It looked like rot, like a dead tree brought inside, its branches sharpened, its silhouette stretched into something tall enough to lean down over a sleeping person and fill their mouth with its labored breath. It didn't speak, it didn't move its arms. It just hovered there, its brambled outline bending over her, pushing the sensation of suffocating warmth over her lips. In that moment, she realized something terrifying. She was fully awake. This wasn't the hazy edge of sleep. She could feel the sheets, the pillow, the angle of her neck. Her thoughts were clear, sharp, and trapped inside a body that didn't dare move.
That's one of the key details skeptics and believers fight over. Full awareness, but total terror. Is the brain stuck between dream and waking? Or is something external actually there, using that in-between state because it's easier to get close?
She felt a surge of panic rising, threatening to turn into a scream. But she knew if she screamed and it reacted, leaned closer, grabbed her, crawled into the bed, there would be no turning back. So she did the only thing she felt she could do. She shut her eyes completely again and started to pray. Not a calm, quiet prayer. She screamed the Lord's Prayer in her mind, forcing every word out with desperate focus, clinging to each line as if it were a rope hanging over a black pit. In her memory, she doesn't know if the words came out loud or only inside her chest. She just remembers pouring everything into that one plea. The breathing stopped. The heat vanished from her mouth. She waited, shaking, heart racing, eyes still closed. Silence. When she finally dared to open them again, the room was empty. No shape darker than the dark. No branches at the foot of the bed, just the familiar outlines of her furniture, the faint glow from the TV as it finally shut off, and the heavy knowledge that something had been there. And now, it was gone. That night, she didn't go back to sleep in the dark. For weeks, she slept with the lights on. Even years later, she would say that waking up in the middle of the night still triggered the same cold fear. Not of what might come, but of what she already knew had once stood there, like a tree uprooted from the earth and replanted beside her bed. Was it a demon, an alien, a hallucination, a living nightmare caused by stress and exhaustion? She never found a definitive answer, but she swore she would go to her grave, telling the same story, exactly as it happened. And as we'll see, when she finally shared her experience, people didn't just argue with her. Some of them claimed to recognize the thing that breathed into her mouth. For days after that night, she barely told anyone what happened. On the surface, nothing had changed. She still woke up at 4 in the morning. She still ran. She still went to class with the same notebook, the same shoes, the same tired smile. But something fundamental had shifted in the way she existed in her own room. The first change was simple. The lights stopped going off. The lamp on her nightstand stayed on. The small TV glowed later into the night. She avoided complete darkness the way some people avoid deep water. Even when she did manage to fall asleep, waking up in the middle of the night now meant one thing: instantly checking the foot of the bed, just to make sure there wasn't a tree standing there.
That's one of the silent scars these encounters leave. You can't prove anything to anyone, but you can't unknow what you saw either. So your behavior changes, and that's what really lasts.
Eventually, she did what so many people do when they can't decide if they're losing their mind or brushing against something supernatural. She posted her story online. Almost immediately, the responses split into two worlds. On one side were the people who spoke the language of neurology and psychology. One of the most calm, detailed replies framed her experience as sleep paralysis. They explained how the brain, under stress, can lock the body down while dream images bleed into the waking world. The commenter mentioned they'd had similar episodes, waking up unable to move, feeling a presence in the room, sometimes even seeing a dark figure standing near the bed while their chest felt heavy. They pointed out the timing: chronic exhaustion from running 5 miles at dawn, constant academic tension and late-night study, irregular sleep patterns, TV on at bedtime. To them, it lined up perfectly with a stress-induced state where the mind is half awake, half dreaming, and desperately trying to build a shape around the terror pressing on the chest. Stress does crazy things to the body, they said, and they weren't wrong.
That explanation is the first one we should always consider. The brain is a powerful liar when it wants to be. Sleep paralysis can mimic hauntings, abductions, demonic attacks. It's a real phenomenon. Ignoring it isn't skepticism, it's just bad investigation.
But even that commenter admitted something uncomfortable. In their own episodes, they usually couldn't move at all. Sometimes they couldn't even force out a sound. In her case, she insisted she was fully awake. She could control her breathing, choose to open and close her eyes, decide to pray. So if it was sleep paralysis, it didn't follow the typical rules. Then came another kind of answer. One person suggested something older than sleep disorders, older than clinical language. They described her intruder in very different terms. It sounded to them like a minor land spirit. A presence tied not to her, but to the place. In their view, devout households, especially strongly religious ones, sometimes attract the attention of what they called small gods of place, or restless entities connected to the land beneath the house. Not in the grand mythology sense, but in the way old folklore talks about spirits of rivers, crossroads, and trees that don't appreciate being ignored. They gave an example. A friend of theirs, also very religious, had once encountered a strange presence at the back of her garden. At first, it would appear as a child at the far end of the yard, just standing, watching. Another night it looked like some other hunched animal-like thing, half hidden near the fence. It didn't attack, it didn't speak, it just toyed with her, tested her, waited for her reaction. Their advice to the friend had been simple: stop feeding it attention. Don't talk to it, don't walk toward it, don't give it fear mixed with curiosity. Keep your spiritual practices, your prayers, your rituals, but don't treat it as someone to converse with. Just hold your ground and let it fade. According to the story, that's exactly what happened. Over time, the appearances dwindled. The shapes at the end of the garden came less often, stayed shorter, grew weaker, until they were gone. Life returned to normal, and the memory turned into another strange story told only in safe company. Was her tree-like intruder something similar? A presence tied to the land under the house, irritated or intrigued by a devout student sleeping alone, level with the ground?
Folklore around the world agrees on one point: you are rarely alone in a place. Rivers, forests, ruins, even old houses have stories of keepers or things that were there before you. Whether those are metaphors or something literal, that's where belief comes in.
Then there was a third, more precise kind of reply, one that tried to map versus the experience. Someone asked her where she lived. When she answered, another user pulled up a map and claimed that multiple ley lines, those supposed lines of energy that run across the earth in certain belief systems, converged near her area. In one version of the map, they said 7 lines intersected not far from Houston. To them, that made her house a kind of spiritual crossroads. A place where, according to that worldview, energy moves in unusual ways and where spiritual or paranormal events are more likely to occur. They didn't speak as pagans or occultists in their explanation. Their language sounded more like a careful priest or a seasoned spiritual advisor would use with a frightened parishioner, gentle, practical, focused on protection rather than fascination. Their advice was simple and grounded in faith. Keep praying, especially out loud, when you feel that presence. If you're comfortable with it, keep a medal or image of Saint Michael nearby as a symbol of protection. Bless the room. Ask for that space to be guarded. Avoid obsessing over the entity. Don't invite it. Don't challenge it. Don't try to communicate. In other words, if this is spiritual, treat it like something real but limited. Don't glorify it. Don't fear it to the point of paralysis. Set boundaries and hold them.
That's something I respect in these kinds of responses. They don't rush to name the creature. They focus on the human side. You're scared? Fine. Let's make you feel safer, whether the thing was in your head or in the room.
Finally, someone asked the inevitable question. What species do you think it was? The answer was almost a shrug wrapped in lore. There are too many types of entities in old stories to pin it down, they said, but if they had to guess, based only on the description, they might think of something like a boggart, a mischievous, sometimes malevolent household spirit, or a furious wood spirit uprooted and forced into a place it didn't belong. But even that, they admitted, was just a label. A way to make a walking tree at the foot of your bed sound like something you could file on a shelf in your brain. And that's the real problem, because whatever you call it, sleep paralysis, land spirit, guardian, demon, stress hallucination, the memory doesn't change. The feeling of hot, labored breath on her mouth doesn't change. The knowledge that when she opened her eyes just a little, something tall and branching and completely wrong was leaning over her doesn't change. Jake, sometimes the label is the least important part. You can call it whatever makes you sleep better. But she still slept with the lights on for weeks. That's the measure of impact. The more you look at her story, the more it pulls on threads from different worlds, medical, spiritual, folkloric. It resonates with tales of shadow people and night terrors, but it also brushes against old European stories of tree spirits and American legends of stickmen and forest guardians. In the next part, we're going to step back and see how her tree at the foot of the bed fits into a much larger pattern of towering, wooden, or branch-headed beings that have been reported in bedrooms, forests, and even on lonely rural roads. Because once you realize how many people claim to have seen something like this, the question stops being, did she imagine it? And becomes, what are all of them seeing? What bothered her most wasn't just what she'd seen. It was how specific it was, not a vague shadow, not a blur, a tree-shaped thing. A figure with a trunk for a body and branches for a head and arms, standing at the foot of her bed like it had grown there while she slept.
When people lie, they usually stay generic. Shadow person, dark shape, something in the corner. The more weirdly specific a description is, the more I pay attention, especially when other people start describing similar details.
After posting her story, she stayed in the comments longer than she expected to. Part of her wanted someone to say exactly what she wanted to hear. It was just stress. It was just your brain. You're fine. It will never happen again. But that's not what she got. Mixed with the explanations about sleep paralysis and stress hormones, a few people quietly dropped something else. They had seen tree things, too. One person talked about waking up in a childhood bedroom and seeing what they thought was a coat stand, until they realized their family didn't own one. It stood between the bed and the door, tall, thin, with too many branch-like arms coming off of it, all ending in blunt tips instead of fingers. They tried to convince themselves it was furniture, but the more their eyes adjusted, the more wrong it looked. The coat stand had a slight bend in its posture, a curve that felt like it was leaning in. When they squeezed their eyes shut and opened them again, it was gone. Another account mentioned a long car trip on a two-lane road that carved through thick forest. It was late, the kind of hour when the trees on either side of the road become a tunnel of black. The driver saw in the high beams what they thought was a young tree at the shoulder, straight trunk, branch crown, motionless. Only as the car got closer, the tree seemed to unfurl. Listen, the trunk shifted. What they thought were branches folded down into arms. For a split second, whatever it was seemed to be stepping away from the road, turning its body as if to avoid the light. They passed it in an instant, too shocked to hit the brakes. By the time their brain fully processed what they'd seen, the rear-view mirror showed only darkness and the red smear of taillights on asphalt.
Classic liminal behavior caught on the edge of a road, moving just enough to show it's not a plant. That's the kind of detail people don't forget, even if they want to.
What ties these scattered stories together isn't just the shape, but the way people describe the emotion out of it. They don't say it looked evil. They say it felt like something that shouldn't be moving was. Our brains are wired to treat trees as background, stable, rooted. When that basic rule breaks, when a tree leans over a bed, breathes, or steps back from the side of the road, something deep inside us reacts before logic catches up. And then there's the folklore. If you go back far enough, you find spirits tied to forests and trees almost everywhere. The names change: dryads, leshy, woodwights, green men, but the themes repeat. Tall beings that blend with trunks and branches, guardians of certain groves, punishers of those who disrespect sacred places. In some stories, they protect. In others, they mislead travelers, drain energy, or simply terrify people for crossing into the wrong part of the woods. Always half seen, always close to trees or being trees. One of the people who replied to her did something interesting with that idea. They didn't say, it was a fairy or it was a demon. Instead, they suggested that in some rare cases, land spirits don't stay politely outside. Sometimes, they said, they follow you inside the house. Not as ghosts tied to a building, but as presences tied to the land under the foundation. An old grove that was cut down, a field that held something important, an intersection of lines people once considered sacred or dangerous.
Think about it like this. If you bulldoze a forest and build a house, you might assume whatever was there before just deletes. Folklore says the opposite. It says, you built your bedroom on top of something that already had a job.
In that view, the thing at the end of her bed wasn't some random demon wandering the earth, picking a house at random. It was something rooted to that place, forced to share territory with a new structure full of light, electrical hum, and human prayer. Most of the time, maybe it stayed where it belonged, just under the floor, just beyond the walls. Until one night, when a girl pushed herself to the limit, her body exhausted, her defenses down, she lay alone on the lowest level of the house, closest to the ground, closest to whatever was anchored there. The perfect moment for something to rise up like smoke through the cracks, take on a shape that matched its nature, branches, trunk, height, and have a look at the sleeping human who never once thought about what used to be here, before the drywall and paint. Does that mean that's what happened? No one can say for sure. But as Jake points out, her experience doesn't live in a vacuum.
On one side, you've got neurologists saying, your brain glitched. On the other, you've got centuries of stories saying, trees see more than you do. When a modern case lines up with an old pattern, that's when my ears perk up.
There's another layer to the tree shape that people don't always notice right away. Trees are but vertical. They connect below and yet above. Roots in the dark, branches in the light. In a lot of symbolic systems, that makes them bridges between worlds. Underworld and sky, The unseen and the visible, the buried and the breathing. So when something that looks like a tree stands in your bedroom right at the foot of your bed, what does that suggest? Maybe it's not just a monster. Maybe it's a messenger. A reminder that your safe little rectangle of light and drywall sits right on top of something older, deeper, and less impressed with your study schedule. And then there's the breathing. Why lean over her face and breathe into her mouth? It's one of the most intimate and invasive things a presence could do. In many cultures, breath is life, spirit. Inhale, exhale. To put your breath into someone else or take theirs is to touch the deepest part of them without leaving a mark. Whatever was in that room wasn't clawing, choking, or dragging. It was sharing something, or testing something, or trying in its way to connect.
Some people read that as feeding, others as contamination. I read it as this: if it's real, it was closing the distance as much as possible, right where you're weakest, as close as a kiss, but without anything human behind it.
She never reported seeing it again. No second night of branches at the bed, no figure in the doorway, no twisted silhouette by the window. The encounter was one night, one moment, one intrusion that left a scar across years of sleep. That's another detail that throws people. If it were purely a recurring sleep disorder, why just once? If it were a demon obsessed with her soul, why never come back? If it were a land spirit curious about the girl in the downstairs room, why be satisfied with a single confrontation? Maybe that's the most unnerving possibility of all. It got exactly what it wanted the first time. It left her terrified of the dark. It carved itself into her memory so deeply that she still thinks about it years later. It made her change her behavior, her sleep, the way she looks at her own room. One visit, permanent presence.
Some things don't need to stay to haunt you. They just need to be seen once, the right way, at the wrong time.
In the next part, we're going to bring everything together. Her experience, the other tree-like encounters, the folklore, the theories, and ask the question that matters for you, watching this right now. If you woke up tonight with something tall and branching standing at the foot of your bed, breathing into your mouth, would you be more afraid that your brain was broken, or that the roots of your house go deeper than you think? Years later, when she tells the story out loud, there's a moment where her voice always changes. It's not when she describes the branches, not when she talks about the height, not even when she remembers the breathing pouring into her mouth like smoke. It's when she says this: I knew it was standing there. It wasn't a dream. I could feel that it was aware of me.
That's the detail I keep coming back to. Awareness. Not just a shape. A presence that noticed her, chose a position at the foot of her bed, and leaned in.
If we step back from her encounter and look at the broader picture, three main explanations try to claim the story. The first is the most comfortable. Her brain did this to her. Sleep paralysis. Hypnopompic hallucination. A body pinned between REM sleep and waking, flooded with chemicals that lock the muscles while the mind thrashes to make sense of the fear. In that state, the brain might grab an image from somewhere. Trees outside, stress, something glimpsed in a movie poster, and twist it into a living nightmare at the foot of the bed. That would explain the clarity, the terror, the feeling of being awake but wrong. It would explain why the breathing sounded real, why the branches seemed to have weight, why she could remember every contour of the room and still know it was wrong. But then comes the second explanation, the one that breathes through the cracks of old myths and quiet warnings. Something was already there. Not a Hollywood demon, not a comic book monster, something quieter and older, a presence tied to the land, the old tree roots, the invisible lines people once avoided building over. A thing that usually stays outside, in the soil and the shadows and the half-forgotten places, until someone ends up sleeping directly above it with a door open in their mind. Maybe it rose because she was exhausted. Maybe it rose because she was devout. Maybe it rose because one of those invisible lines of energy people talk about in whispers really does pass near her home, and she just happened to be the most vulnerable person in the house. In that version of the story, the tree-like figure didn't appear from her mind. It stepped soon into it.
If you treat it like a visitor, the whole scene changes. The breathing isn't just a glitch, it's contact. It's a boundary violation. It's something testing how far into your little bubble of light it can reach.
The third explanation sits somewhere between the brain and the spirit world. It suggests that the human mind is a kind of receiver, tuned not just to what's physically in front of us, but to things we don't usually perceive. Stress, sleep disruption, emotional strain. These might weaken the filters that keep us focused on the ordinary. In that crack between realities, the mind might latch onto something that doesn't normally have form. It gives it a shape that makes sense: a tree, a human, a hybrid. Something vertical, rooted and towering, like a living conduit between what's below and what's above. Is that a monster? Or is it a symbol your nervous system builds to process something too large and strange to fit into words? The problem is, all three explanations can sit in the same room without cancelling each other out. Her brain was under pressure. Her house sat on land with its own history. Her faith and fear shaped the way she interpreted what she saw. What we know for sure is what happened after. She changed. The downstairs room stopped being just a bedroom and became a thin place, a spot where the world had proven itself unreliable. The darkness wasn't just lights off anymore. It was the color of that figure's body. The air wasn't just air, it was what had flowed in and out of her lungs with that heavy, ragged breath. She kept a stronger spiritual routine. She paid more attention to what she watched, what she thought about before sleep. She took seriously the advice to set boundaries, not just physically with locked doors and turned on lamps, but spiritually with prayer and intention. Because if it had been only a hallucination, she tells herself, it shouldn't have felt so targeted. It knew where to stand. It knew how close to lean. It knew to avoid touching anything but the one place she couldn't ignore: her breath.
That's predatory intelligence, or at least strategic. Whether we explain it with neurons or with ghosts, the behavior we're seeing is find the weakest point, get as close as possible, leave no trace except the memory.
And for everyone listening, another unsettling thought starts to creep in. What if the tree part wasn't random? Out there in the dark, on roads, in forests, at the edge of fields, people keep reporting tall, thin figures they first mistake for saplings or posts. Only when those trees move, when they unfurl or step back or lean forward, does the brain realize it's looking at something else. Maybe, just maybe, the thing at the foot of her bed was one of those same beings. Not in its natural habitat, not beside a highway or buried in a grove, but inside, where it had no right to be. A forest thing in a human room, a border creature crossing a line. And if that's true, then her encounter isn't just a one-off horror story. It's part of a pattern where something tall and branch-like learns to stand perfectly still until the right moment, then chooses whether to reveal that it can move. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a girl who still remembers the weight of a gaze she never actually saw, a bedroom that to her never quite felt ordinary again, a set of stories from strangers who saw tree things on roadsides, in corners, in the periphery of their lives. And it leaves us with a question that sits right at the core of this channel. When a presence that looks like a tree and breathes like a dying man stands at the foot of your bed, Jake, is it a monster?
If it can reach into your life, change the way you sleep, and still leave you wondering if it was ever really there. That's close enough to a monster for me. The label doesn't matter. The impact does.
A date. Maybe one night, long after this video ends, you'll wake up in a room you thought you knew, and the dark will feel just a little too dense at the foot of your bed. Maybe you'll feel warmth on your lips, a breath that doesn't belong to you. Maybe you'll tell yourself it's just your imagination, a leftover image from some story you heard online. Or maybe you'll keep your eyes shut and pray that whatever is standing there, rooted in a place older than your house and taller than your courage, decides, just this once, to leave as quietly as it came. Because sometimes, the only thing more terrifying than knowing there's a monster in your room is never being able to prove it was there at all.